Welcome to the Rochester, New Hampshire History Podcast, a monthly show that will shine a light on a piece of history that has been all but forgotten.
From Rochester, New Hampshire, the Graniteers.
The Rochester Graniteers was an award-winning drum and bugle corps that had its heyday in the 1950s and 60s. It was considered one of the best in the state, and here's an interesting story. And it starts with a Rochester native, Ray Turmel, who started the Graniteers in 1958.
In 1955, Ray was the Boy Scout master at Troop 186 in Rochester. While at a Boy Scout jamboree in Canada, he witnessed several other scout troops that had their own drum corps. It sparked a desire to start a similar group with Troop 186. Well, the first thing needed was to acquire instruments. Ray remembered as a child watching a drum corps parading in Rochester from the Union members of the Mayberry Shoe Company. The Mayberry Shoe Band had long since disbanded, but where were their instruments? With a little bit of hunting and detective work, the instruments were found gathering dust in a barn on Charles Street. The Boy Scout troop got permission to use the old instruments, and the first thing they noticed was the instruments were in bad shape. The drums were cracked, the bugles were dented, and the valves and tubing were welded in place from corrosion. With determination and a lot of elbow grease, the instruments were repaired and ready to be played. The next step was to find instructors that could teach youngsters how to play instruments. Jack Snyder, owner of the curtain shop and an accomplished drummer, became the drum instructor. Lucien LaCourse stepped in and became the bugle instructor. Lucien had been involved with the drum corps in Sumsworth and knew a lot about trumpets. With two great instructors and willing kids, the Rochester Boy Scout Troop's drum and bugle corps were formed. By 1956, they had 28 members and were in parades, field maneuvering, and competitions.
In October of 1957, they won their first trophy in Manchester, New Hampshire, and they soon were participating in more parades and competitions. They ran into one problem, and that was time. Practicing for the drum and bugle corps, competing, and performing in parades all cut into time needed for actual Boy Scout activities. When a girl color guard was added, it was time for them to become independent of the Boy Scouts. In 1958, the Rochester Graniteers were born. The newly formed drum and bugle corps asked for help in financing their venture from the city and private companies, but were unsuccessful. So the Graniteers financed themselves with many fundraisers. The Graniteers was a junior corps, which meant you could participate if you were younger than 21. At the beginning, most of the kids were 12 to 14 years of age, and if you were younger than 12, you became a granite chip, where you would learn the ropes until you were old enough to work with the older kids.
Practices were held Thursday night at the Army Reserve Center in Rochester Hill. They also rehearsed behind McCullen School as well, sometimes in a horde of mosquitoes, never complaining. Probably not many people know is that most of the members did not know how to read music. They painstakingly practiced their routines until they had perfected them. Within a year, the Graniteers became one of the best-known musical outfits in the area. By 1959, the kids' hard work had paid off, and they earned 11 trophies. They were known locally and throughout New England as a hard-working and talented group. The Graniteers' membership swelled to 64 members. In 1960, it actually proved more successful as their membership grew. They received more invitations to parades, and local newspapers were filled with pictures and articles of them.
It was an exciting time in Rochester when John F. Kennedy was elected president, and the Graniteers were selected to participate in the president's 1961 inaugural parade. The whole town of Rochester got behind them and helped raise the funds needed to send them to Washington. It was below freezing the day of the inaugural parade, and alcohol was applied to the valves of their instruments to prevent the instruments from freezing up. Ignoring the wind and a 20-degree temperature, the kids marched flawlessly as millions of eyes were upon them. After their successful showing in Washington, the Graniteers returned to Rochester as the pride of the city. The Rochester Courier, in their January 26, 1961 edition, wrote, "They probably were not recognized as unusual among all the strutting drum corps and the bands and the huge spectacle, but for a moment they were a part of history in the eyes of millions across the broad land. They were our kids, spirited, clean American youth, and we were proud of them."
In the early days, the Graniteers had an old milk truck to carry their equipment, which they used to travel to competitions and performances throughout New England. The parents and kids would follow in over a dozen cars. Their fundraisers consisted of selling candy door to door, collecting marching fees, hosting baked bean suppers, and collecting donations. That all changed when the Graniteers took over Beano on Saturday night in Rochester. In the 1960s, it was a law that only one Beano event could be held a night. After that point, the Holy Rosary Church had been running the Saturday night Beano. When the church got new leadership that frowned upon gambling, they gave up Beano. The Graniteers quickly took over Saturday night Beano. The kids and the parents ran the Beano games from the Knights of Columbus Hall and brought in a lot of money. With that money, they purchased 2 new fancy buses, an equipment van, new uniforms, and new instruments. The new buses were needed now that the Graniteers were popular and making up to 50 appearances throughout New England. The Beano games were really popular, and buses would bring people from far away as Lewiston, Maine. To entice people to come to Beano night, the Graniteers would deduct the cost of anyone's bus ticket from the cost of their Beano cards.
Even with all their achievements and positive newspaper articles, if you went to Spalding High School and was a member of the Graniteers, you could not be in the high school band. For some unknown reason, the Rochester school system was unsupportive of the Graniteers, even though they told the school system that the high school band practice would always take precedence over the Graniteers' activities. The Graniteers were in the national spotlight again in 1964 when they performed at the New England Pavilion at the New York's World's Fair. At the World's Fair, they put on 2 half-hour programs, much to the delight of the crowd. The programs consisted of a field drill, parading, and standstill exhibition. Rochester welcomed the Graniteers back from New York with a celebration at the parking lot of the City Hall that was attended by the mayor and other local dignitaries.
In September 1967, the Graniteers competed in the International Circuit Finals in Montreal, Canada, competing against some of the top groups in Canada. They came in third with a score of 81.2, which was 0.4 of a point under the second-place winner. The end of the 1960s was also the beginning of the end of the Graniteers. In 1969, all the young kids who started out in 1958 were 18 years or older. Most of them left to attend college or were drafted into the military, and some got married. The Graniteers did not have enough kids to field the junior corps, and the membership dwindled drastically. The Graniteers changed into a senior corps, which meant that anyone 21 years or older could participate. That did not work out well, as the older members were not as disciplined or committed as the younger kids were. They could not continue, and the decision was made to disband. They faded into history, leaving behind a 12-year legacy of over 300 trophies and excellence.
When the Graniteers disbanded, they also had a new building. On Eastern Avenue, they built the Graniteer Hall, which was intended to be their new home, and it was designed for great acoustics and had lots of room for marching and practicing. I spoke to Ray about what happened to the building. He told me that the Legion Post 7 was given the building free of charge. The American Legion took over the mortgage on the building. Around this time, another drum and bugle corps from Massachusetts lost everything in a fire. The Graniteers donated all their instruments and uniforms to them.
Corps Director Ray Trammell stated, "Throughout the years, we were fortunate to have some of the best instructors the drum corps world had to offer. William Brooks, color guard instructor, Richard Grant and Earl Powell on drums, Raymond Spencer and Harry O'Neill on bugles. Alan Brooks and Robert Santerio on marching and maneuvering worked tirelessly to transform raw recruits into talented members of the Class A Drum and Bugle Corps." And this ends the podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please email bobgriffinpodcast@gmail.com and come back next month for another episode of Rochester, New Hampshire History.